Father Denis is no stranger to Tolworth or many of us. And I don't think, personally, I think he's the best scripture scholar that we have in the country. In the sense, he can make scripture alive for today. You know, the way he presents the scripture, it becomes alive. So I'm delighted to welcome Father Denis. Denis, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Holy Canon Edward, for your invitation. When Edward introduces you so graciously, you're trying to spot yourself in the introduction. The best thing to do is to leave immediately and keep your fictional reputation to itself. When you start with the resurrection of Jesus in the Gospels, you know there's lots of descriptions of Jesus during the public ministry. You watch him. You hear him. In the Passion story, you watch how he endures suffering. Now, when it comes to the resurrection, this is a famous painting by Piero della Francesca. This is the one thing that you do not see in any of the Gospels. None of the evangelists even attempt to describe the resurrection itself. The evangelists move from the burial of Jesus' body and they pass over the resurrection in total silence. How do we know Jesus was risen? You have to look to the experience of the community. It's as if the evangelists say the resurrection of Jesus is beyond the reach of words or the command of language. They don't do it. There's one gospel that did it. You might have heard of this gospel, the Gospel of Peter. It's got nothing to do with Peter. It was written in the 2nd century. Have a look at this. Now in the night in which the Lord's day dawned, as the soldiers were keeping guard 2 by 2 in every watch, there came a great sound in the heaven, and they saw the heavens opened, and 2 men descend, shining with a great light, and drawing near to the tomb. And the stone that had been set on the door rolled away by itself, and went back to the side, and the tomb was opened, and both of the young men entered it. When the soldiers saw this, they woke up the centurion and the elders, for they also were there keeping watch. And while they were telling them the things they had seen, they saw again 3 men come out of the tomb, and 2 of them sustaining the other, and a cross following after them. The 2 they saw had their heads reaching up to heaven, but the one they led had his head overpassing the heavens. And then they heard a voice out of the heavens saying, "Have you preached to those who sleep?" An answer was heard from the cross saying, "Yes." The church said, "No, thank you." Why do you think that was written like that? I was giving a course in Sophia University in Japan, and there was a very bright young kid in the front row, and he was studying New Testament and film, which is an interesting combination. And he put up his hand and he said, Professor, is that true?" And I said, "If it were true, what difference would it make?" He said, "It makes the women unnecessary." This is now replaced with men. Look at the language. When the soldiers saw this, they woke up the centurion, and while they were telling them the things they had seen, it puts in male witnesses to the resurrection. Whereas all the other 4 Gospels that we have accepted give a key role to the women. If God's act of raising Jesus from the dead lies beyond the reach of language or the range of narrative expression, the evangelists do more than offer their readers summary proclamations. They offer the readers 2 distinct stories. The first one is the finding of the empty tomb, and the second one is the appearance of the risen Jesus to his followers. Now that follows, if you look at the early preaching of the church, Peter and Paul, they proclaim God raised Jesus from the dead. A proclamation. That's not a story, is it? If you look up above, the evangelists have got to put the proclamation into story. They choose the best way of communicating the message of Jesus is to tell the story. They don't write an essay, do they? They don't write a big long creed. They don't write a big treatise. They tell a story. So the proclamation, God raised Jesus from the dead, is now told through the story of the empty tomb, and we are witnesses to this, is now told as the appearances. See, the role of the women is embarrassingly crucial. The male apostles of Jesus missed the highest drama about Jesus. And what was that? His passion and death. They were not there. And if you're not there, how can you witness? If you were, the purpose of a witness is someone who can say, I saw. I mean, if you were called into court and the judge said to you, were you in Sainsbury's at the checkout when this woman was murdered on Thursday? And you say, God help us, where was I on Thursday? What was I doing? Was I saying my novena in the back of the church? And the judge will say, thank you, you're excused. Because you can't act as a witness. Look at this. Only the women are there for the way of the cross, the crucifixion of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and the burial of the body. Only them. Now, I think the evangelists would have loved to have started the resurrection with the male disciples. But if the male disciples ran to an empty tomb, what's the question? What's the problem? They didn't know where Jesus was buried. People could say, of course the tomb was empty, it's the wrong tomb. The evangelists have no alternative but to start the resurrection with the women, because they were the ones who attended the death and the burial of Jesus. And there's only one evangelist who recognizes that fully, and that is Luke. And he's going to pay attention to this. They now revisit the tomb where they buried the body. They find it empty. They hear the angel saying, he is not here. He's risen. And they return and tell the story to the men. And how do the men respond? They regard the women's testimony as utter, pure nonsense. So the evangelists are on shaky grounds here. Although they've got witnesses, the male apostles in the group don't believe them themselves. So they're asking us to do something the original apostles didn't, aren't they? Namely, to accept the testimony of the women. So we're going to move now, dear friends, a great story movement from the disciples' destructive experience of the death of Jesus. You've got a breakdown of discipleship. Totally. Separation, loss, and flight. In John 21, the disciples run back to Galilee, and what do? They go back fishing. They go back doing what they used to do before they met him. When your world collapses, what do? You try to pick up the rhythm of the old pieces, don't you? And try and start over again. You do your best. And that's what they do. They go back to who they used to be and what they used to do, what they knew, and that was fishing. And they live in the new absence of Jesus. And yet when you look at the story of the early church, you've got this fantastic change, don't you? You've got the disciples' proclamation about Jesus. This is from the Acts of the Apostles. That God has made him both Lord and Christ. You crucified Jesus, but God has made him Lord and Christ. And then you've got the renewal of discipleship. You've got the refounding of the community. You've got fearless preaching. A new attachment to Jesus as Lord. How on God's earth do you account for that change? That's not a natural change, is it? You know, sometimes when people change, we say to them, God, what happened to you? The presumption being they didn't organize it themselves. That something must have happened to them. I mean, if you've got a relative who never smiles even on feast days, and then you meet him coming through the front door and he's jumping with joy, what would your question be? What happened to you? Something must have happened to him in order to undergo this change. This is Luke's great narrative because he's the only one who's going to continue it, dear friends, into the Acts of the Apostles. The empty tomb doesn't solve anything. When the women go to the empty tomb, Luke's a wonderful psychologist. He's always interested in how people react to things. He doesn't tell you this happened. He tells you how people react, and they're totally bewildered. And then you've got the angel's appearance. Now, I don't know why Catholics think angels have wings. There's 4 qualifications for being an angel. You have to be young. You have to be male. Sorry about that. You have to be very well dressed. And you have to know what's going on. They're described as young men in brilliant clothing. And when they appear, you take notes, because nobody else knows what's going on. And they're the ones you listen to. The seraphim and the cherubim, they're the ones that have wings. Angels are young men in brilliant clothing, and they appear. How did they get from heaven? They have to fly, obviously, according to some people. Angels appear. The Epistle to the Hebrews says, some people have met angels without recognizing them. Think about that. So if you have two guys sitting at your dining room table with wings, you're going to recognize them. The trouble is, you can meet angels and you don't know it. They've got an insight into what's going on. And they communicate that as they do to the women. They remind the women of Jesus' prophetic words. And then they become the first missionaries, the women. They tell all this as message, and they are met with total disbelief. Remember, at those times, dear friends, a woman could not be a witness in a court of law. This was not just in Judaism, it was across the Mediterranean world. If you murdered your cousin in the presence of two female witnesses, they could not appear against you, because the word was regarded as not trustworthy in a court of law. And that's why the evangelists tell you the reaction. In other words, at the time, the men who listened to them themselves didn't believe them. Does that make sense? That's a measure of the time that they're living in. When the women speak, they're simply automatically disbelieved. The empty tomb is checked by Peter, and he's amazed. But amazement, dear friends, is amazement is amazement. Amazement is not faith. The empty tomb solves nothing. What does it do? It underlines the split in the community between the men and the women. The empty tomb solves nothing. It actually underwrites the already existing break between the faithful women and the runaway men. So it solves nothing. And then Luke moves to what is probably one of the most beautiful stories in the whole of the Gospels. Jesus' presence. And then his final one is the appearance to the disciples. Now, there are three great stories, dear friends, in all four Gospels about Jesus. There's the story of his ministry, the story of his passion and death, and the story of his resurrection. But none of the evangelists tell just that story. One of the stories they tell alongside the story of Jesus is the story of discipleship. And during the ministry, Jesus calls them to follow him, and they attach themselves to him. That's the great story of discipleship. Follow him. What happens in the Passion and Death? You've got a totally, radically different story. And this is a story you could see happening in the church today. A story of separation and loss. Of people who used to be attached. Now, that attachment evaporates or goes away. And then the story in the resurrection is the beautiful story of new attachment to Jesus as Lord. Dear friends, if you are living in attachment to somebody, what's your big fear? That they'll go. They will be taken from you. It's not just one of the things that was interesting in doing psychology was learning about the greatest fear of all children, which is separation anxiety. That the people they love and depend on utterly will be taken away from them. I remember when the four of us were kids and my mum would get mad. She'd put on her coat, hat and handbag and say, "I'm off." And then she would go into the bathroom and lock the door. But we reckoned it was pretty safe because she still had her slippers on. She wasn't going anywhere. And if you're living, dear friends, if you're living in the midst of separation and loss, what's your dream? That either you will accept that, or a dream that one day you will feel again a new attachment, so that your life will not be lived in a wilderness of separation and loss. John Bowlby, who's a brilliant English psychologist, after spending years and years listening to people, wrote 3 books. Of the 3 great themes, he said, in human life, one is called separation, one is called loss, and the other one is called attachment. And he said those 3 great themes, attachment, separation and loss, happen over and over again in the human story. And much of our own maturity and happiness is defined by how we respond to those 3 things. So in this story, it's the only story in the whole of the New Testament, you watch 2 disciples walk on this journey from separation and loss into new attachment to the Lord. And the story begins, as you know, they're leaving. That same day, 2 of them were on their way to a village near Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. If you go to the Holy Land today, there's 3 places claiming to be Emmaus: El Kabeba, Latrum, and Abu Ghosh. You go to each of them and they say welcome to the real Emmaus. It's the road that matters in this story. It's one of the famous lost roads in history. And even if we could identify the village, the road is missing. And it's the road we dream of. It's a wonderful road where you can share the burden of our disappointments. We can be honest about the defeat of hopes that once defined us, and be touched again by the wisdom of this compassionate stranger who walks beside us. And that road is inside each of us. The road to Emmaus, dear friends, appears a particularly modern one. You have people journeying inside their story of separation and loss, and struggling to find a language for their pain and bewilderment. When you ask the 2 disciples of Emmaus, "How are you doing?" they do not say fine. They're ferociously honest about their condition. And they're going to share their pain and loss. Lord Byron wrote these lines, which I think are wonderful. He could have been commenting on Emmaus. "All that memory loves the most was once our only hope to be. And all that hope adored and lost has melted into memory." That is precisely the story of these 2 disciples. And you're going to listen to them share 2 things. They're going to share their experience of Jesus. They were his followers. And they're going to share their expectations of Jesus. Dear friends, if you've got a good experience of people, it gives rise to have expectations about them. If your experience of people is utterly negative, you're not going to have any expectations, are you? Expectations rise out of a very positive experience of people. They say, Luke's a very fine writer, he would have been a film director today. Jesus walks by their side, and then he invites them to tell their story. The focus is going to be on them. What things are you discussing as you walk along? What's going on in your life? And Luke says immediately their faces fell and they stopped. He's a very bright writer. Luke says, look at their face before you listen to them. If you're listening to someone, dear friends, and there's a difference between what they're saying and how they look, what do you believe? People are natural psychologists. They listen to you more from your face than your words. And they will cancel your words immediately if the words are not supported by the face. It's a funny thing to say, but we've never seen our face, have we? It's impossible. You can see a reflection of it when you're alone. And you go to the mirror and you prepare yourself. And you have a look. And what do? You fix up. Our eye is educated to be critical. And you see things immediately that need altering. I mean, have you ever been to a big store and you've gone up the elevator and when you turn left you catch a sudden sight of yourself? And nearly everyone adjusts because you're not prepared. Sometimes we're very careful about our words and we forget to rearrange our face. And somebody can say to us, you did very well, but you should have seen the face you had on. And these disciples, who they are is shown in their face, and their face, like them, is fallen. And they speak about Jesus. They speak out of their experience of him. Dear friends, they saw what Jesus did. They listened to his words, and they came to the conclusion what name to give him. And they decided, given the mighty deeds and words he's spoken, that Jesus of Nazareth was surely a prophet. That was for sure. Right? That was for sure. They knew that. But their experience of Jesus, dear friends, was so positive, they had growing expectations that Jesus would be much more than a prophet. In fact, that he would be the one, the Messiah, to set Israel free. And in the language of the gospel, dear friends, they say, our own hope, listen to this language, our own hope had been that he would be the one to set Israel free. They cancelled their hopes. Why? They did believe it, but now they've decided to cancel their hopes. Their own hopes had been. Why would they cancel their hopes in Jesus? For a very simple reason. He was put to death by the chief priests. That's their experience as well. The official estimation of Jesus was made by the chief priests and the leaders, that he was a criminal worthy of execution. That's the official estimate of Jesus, which is a world away from the disciples' estimate of Jesus, that he would be the one to set Israel free. Who are they? They're ex-disciples of a dead prophet. That's a shattering identity to have, isn't it? I remember in Hawkston when we ran the courses for religious, we had a wonderful sister from Kenya, very, very intelligent, 6'5". And she stood up to introduce herself. And she said, "I used to be a Mother General." A little voice beside her said, but who are you now? You don't want to define yourself by your past that's gone. And all these disciples can say is that they used to be disciples of a prophet who's been put to death. Where are they going? They're leaving. Sometimes it's not your destination that's important. You just want to get out. And it doesn't matter where you go, as long as that place is over your shoulder. If you have a place that's associated with your defeat, it's natural, isn't it, that you want to put distance between yourself and that place. But we can put distance between ourselves and that place, but we take the experience with us, and that's what they do. They've left Jerusalem, but their mind is dominated by the loss that they have experienced. And their outlook, our own hopes had been that he would be the one. There's no pretense when you listen to these two. They don't smother up how they feel. They don't decorate it. They say it like it is. Everything they hoped for is gone. Now, everyone in this room has a graveyard of hopes. You can think of things you used to hope in, but no longer do. You've given them up. I put some up here for myself. I used to hope that our loved ones would not be taken from us, that things would get easier, that every hurt would be balanced by joy, that God would become clearer somehow, that peace would be secured among peoples, that comedy would triumph, that justice would be established, that our good health would endure, that people would become kinder, that racism would be unknown, that every religion would be esteemed, that tragedy would happen only on stage, that wrinkles would appear only in our clothing, that we could lay down our burdens, that we could forsake our sins, that we would not be forgotten. It goes on, making for the largest cemetery in the world. And you could see them laying down their most precious hope. It's not just the body of Jesus that's buried. What else is buried? the hope. It's the language you hear. If you've been to the funeral of a young person who's died out of season, and you listen to mum and dad, it's the kind of language they use. We had great hopes for John. And one of the tragedies of the funeral is not just to bury John, but to bury the hopes that you had for him, that he would be this one or that. Is that making sense? That's a normal thing. There's nothing odd about it, dear friends. Okay. Big question, and I love this question. Do you still hope when everything around you looks hopeless? In other words, do you think the two disciples of Emmaus are right? If your experience tells you not to hope, you give up the hope. Where do you get your hope from when everything around you is destroyed? Do you still stubbornly hope? You might have heard of a guy, a brilliant man called Václav Havel. He spent most of his life in a communist prison, had no expectation of getting out, and then, like Mandela, when he did get out of prison, he became president. From prison to presidency in one short walk. This is what he said. He was asked why he continued to hope when there was no prospect of him ever getting out of prison. He said, the kind of hope I think about, particularly in hopeless situations, such as being in prison, is a state of the mind, not a state of the world. Either we have hope in us, or we do not. It's a dimension of the soul. And this is brilliant, this bit. Hope is not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not prognostication. You know, if you go to a doctor and given the situation you're in, he'll give you a prognosis, given what he sees. Václav Havel said, hope's not about that. It's an orientation of the spirit. It transcends the world immediately experienced. It's anchored somewhere beyond the horizon. I think the deepest and most important form of hope, the only one that can keep us above the water, is that we get it, as it were, from elsewhere. You need somewhere else to go when everything around you is fractured and broken. You need to live inside a larger story than yourself, than what's happening to you now, because that can overtake everything, can't it? If your world is, if you're in very bad shape, dear friends, and you go to a good psychiatrist, you need help. Where will the psychiatrist take you? They will always take you backwards. They will leave the situation you're in now. Because in that situation there are no answers now. You have to go elsewhere. And that's what you have to go elsewhere. What was your relationship like with your father? How did you get on with your mother? How many brothers and sisters did you have? Where were you in the family? How did you feel? When you were a child, did your mother keep dropping you? Is this why you're so hard-headed? The answer always lies outside the situation. Always. If I can give an example of this, there was a sister who was on the missions. She came to the course in Hawkston, and she hadn't been back for about 4 years, and her mum was getting old, so she was going to stay with her mum during the break for a week, and she was anxious about it. And she said, I've always had this suspicion that my mother's never loved me. And I said, has she ever said anything or done anything to justify that? She said, that's the puzzling thing, no. But she says, I've always felt it deeply. I said, your mum is approaching death. Why don't you ask her? Why don't you find a language for the way that you feel and talk to your own mum? She said she would. When she came back, she told me, she says, when I told Mum, Mum started to cry. And her mother had been raped when she was 19, and she was the child of the rape. And she made a very tough decision to keep the child. And a year later she met her future husband. She told him what happened, and he said he would love this child because it would become his. And she never ever suspected her father, who was not her father. She never suspected that anything. He loved her. And the answer to her present problem lay in the womb of her mother. And she was mightily relieved, although it was a very sad story. The sad story back then actually made sense of her now. We can only understand life backwards. Praise God, it is time for a pipe smoke.